we brought together loose groups, structured groups. In many ways, we try to see how the Citizens Manifesto priorities can be used as a basis for election. The things they agreed to when we did the first KAP, the most important for them was water. People said, we need water. We need someone who can bring us water. I can say one of the things that influenced that research was because the research was done in March. It's a big dry season where most of the water wells will run dry. So it may not be the case if we do it in at another time. So it was water, it was food, they talk about livelihoods, it was jobs. Then later down, you talk about infrastructure. And politicians always know that those are immediate priorities. If you need water, you can get water. I can get bowsers of water for you in an elections week. I can get food for you in an elections week. But the idea behind the Citizens Manifesto is how do we address the perennial problems that haunt us? How do we translate elections into results? Because many African countries are doing competitive party politics. They are doing competitive elections. And hardly do you see elections translating into real development outcomes. So the Citizens Manifesto was to initiate a conversation as to how could policy matter in an elections environment.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Did the leaders embrace the proposed reforms that you came up with in the manifesto? Do you think it had an impact on the electoral process? What are the lessons learned from 2018 that you will take moving forward?
By the next election, there will be another Citizens Manifesto. So at least something fundamental was introduced. We wanted to achieve this, we got this. But fundamentally, we've introduced a culture of having policy-based conversation at the time of elections. How do we ensure that young men, as a country coming from conflicts where there are always incidences of electoral violence? So the Citizens Manifesto in many ways provided that basis, and it dovetailed into the first presidential debate. Over 40% of the country listened to that debate, and over at least 12% of the people said, I voted because I listened to that, to the debate shaped my view. So if you look at the electoral map after the elections, this was the very first time Sierra Leone had, in a major way, because Sierra Leone has been having some, apart from the two major parties, some minority parties coming in. The very first time we were having 4 major parties in parliament, it actually showed a different shade, a different democratic shade. So Citizens Manifesto was a big democratic milestone for Sierra Leone. It laid the foundation for conversation. 7 of the priorities that were selected, one was, a lot of women were saying, we want to be represented in parliament, because one of the biggest causes of the Sierra Leone war was exclusion. And young people were saying, we want 15% of the candidates nominated by political parties to be young people. Women went as far as 40%. And there was a third choice where people were saying, we need accountable, ethical leadership. So we want to use the Citizens Manifesto to address corruption. So it's in a way, the Citizens Manifesto was used to introduce conversation around political behaviors. It's not just about providing water, but how are you going to assure us that you will take a certain set of behaviors that will make you provide water once you're in power?
That's great. And a lot of your work examines how political incentives can shape institutional performance, especially in fragile state context. And you've spoken a bit about social accountability. So what does that mean to you, the term social accountability? And how does it matter to the democratic processes of a weak state? And additionally, in terms of, since the IGR was founded, What are some changes that you've seen socially or politically in Sierra Leone?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned social accountability. For a weak state, if you push institutions that are weak, already weak, there's a tendency for them to collapse. What has made us not to slide back into conflict since the war ended about 18 to 20 years ago is how do we always make sure that we are mindful of where we came from. We demand accountability, we demand standards, but we're mindful of fragility as well. So you do that by building trust. So always we ask ourselves, how many blocks of confidence have we built? So you build trust between citizens and government. We make sure that our institutions are not perfect. It's not a U.S. Senate. It's a weak parliament where the institutions can be polarized. But at the same time, we use citizen voices as a platform for conversation. Like the paper we did on the census, where it was the most influential paper we've ever done. Parliament spent at least 40% of one of its debates looking into the census. Taking it otherwise to say, this group wants to be marginalized by the other group, and that it will have resulted to violence. But we introduced that, and then it provided a foundation for conversation. So that's always what we do. For IGR, with our mantra being bridging the gap between knowledge and policy, we believe that the biggest area of conflict has been around resource allocation. So we've done quite a number of papers. One of the papers we did was the cost of politics. We asked ourselves, why are institutions not performing the way they should perform? Why is the parliament weak? Why is the executive weak? So instead of really just sitting down and blaming, we always ask, what can we do to make institutions perform properly? One of the theses we have is that institutions behave unproductively because the context in which they operate. It's not just about, yes, the leaders can be wicked. You can demonize them for all you care. But certain times, the context in which institutions perform, do not produce results. So if you take a Sierra Leonean politician to the UK, to the US, the institutions in those countries will not necessarily allow them to behave the way they behave. So in the cost of politics, we specifically looked at what is making parliament ineffective. So we look at MP allowances, MP salaries, and we compare that with MP expenditures. And we realize that if you compute the MP allowance and salaries in a given month, in a given year, is way lower than what the MP earns. And then this crucial factor that actually shapes politics, the way citizens demand, what are citizens' expectations, because people always demand very personalized benefits. So this MP should give me, money when I need money. They should give me address to my medical needs. They should address to my child's educational needs. So we realize that all that makes parliament dysfunctional. So we need a conversation between citizens and parliamentary institutions. How do we ensure that parliament is better situated to support citizens' priorities? So the cost of politics was about that. After we published the cost of politics, 6 months after, there was a citizen, I can call it a big backlash from citizens after Parliament published their request for pay rise. So IGR was, among one of the only organizations that came to the rescue of Parliament, that, we need a broader conversation. We know citizens are angry with you. Maybe you've made a raise too much, but we know what your problems are. So how do we get a conversation on this? So we did a paper on pay and compensation of members of Parliament.
So IGR's mission is to bridge the gap between knowledge and policy. But there's also a gap between policy and politics. And politicians exist in the political arena, and we have to think about how to incentivize good behavior. We can talk about weak institutions, but that's kind of abstract. Politicians within those institutions, within parliament, within executive and various agencies in Sierra Leone and countries like that in Africa have incentives to participate in corruption, to mobilize voters along ethnic lines, to do things that are not in the voters' interest. So how do you, at IGR, take seriously the reality of the political process?
Normally, what many politicians want is to stay in power. And normally what many citizens want is to get better welfare. And too often, citizens in a weak and polarized state, there's a tendency for citizens to get distracted. And then they kind of pursue the agenda of the politician. So instead of demanding healthcare, they say, I'm supporting my brother. Brother does not deliver. I normally say this story that if you dress, the two major colors, party colors, are red and green, and they are situated in the south and east, and in the north and west. So geographically, the country is kind of divided along those party lines. So there is a tendency for you to dress someone that is unaccountable in red, and then that person says, just a popular language in the north, say, Pierre Seke, and then they vote for that person. You can do the same for the south. You can dress someone unaccountable in green, and the person says, Bua Bisie, and then the person, is being voted in. So what we normally do, we introduce not only rewards, but we introduce sanctions. I think the biggest challenge which many organizations face is how do we align those interests. Yes, you want to stay in power, or you want to come to power, but there are certain things we consider for you to be given the trust, that authority. For 2018 in particular, we developed what we call the biometer. In the elections, we are tracking campaign promises of all leading aspirants, at least the 4 leading aspirants. So because the biometer is really following some of the actions that are being supported by the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. In Nigeria, you have the Buhari meter. In Senegal, you have the Sal meter. In Macky Sall, after Macky Sall. So in Sierra Leone, Madabi won the election. So we track his promises. He made 556 promises. So we put that in one document, and it becomes the measure for opposition parties to hold him to account, and for civil society to hold him to account. So we disaggregate those promises by clusters. These are your promises in agriculture. These are your promises in healthcare. Every year, by next year, we'll be publishing the biometer for year 2. We've got people within government that are doing shadow scoring of the biometer. So they also score themselves. Like I said, our mantra is do not antagonize them, but just make sure that we have the same journey. We want good healthcare. We want good education. If you do not deliver us, in fact, we are not putting these targets for you. You set the targets. If you do not deliver us, and what does democracy provide? Democracy provides one environment where you have an alternative, a given period, then we can talk about changing that party after elections.
So my own background is in global health, so I'm particularly interested in learning a bit more about the IGR's work in monitoring health investments in Sierra Leone post the Ebola outbreak of 2014-2015. And when you have a country like Sierra Leone that already has, weakened institutions and is really making an attempt to develop economically, what were the unique challenges that the country faced when, on top of that, there was this disastrous public health outbreak that not only caused health problems in the country, but economically, it was really difficult for the country to recover. So what have you seen in the past 3-4 years since the outbreak that, the IGR has been monitoring in terms of health investments or just economic investments to try to rebuild from that outbreak?
I think one of the things that Ebola did was to further destroy service delivery infrastructure, delivery of health, delivery of education. I think for many commentators, they argue that Ebola is just a microcosm. It just showed a microcosm of a Sierra Leone problem. It shows that healthcare was not working. So Ebola came 15 years after post-conflict peace building, and it showed that we did not invest much in decentralized services. We did not invest much in local institutions. So you have this massive presence of NGOs over time. So less than 1% of aid actually goes through local structures. So of Ebola, it was very easy for Ebola to overrun from the border with Liberia, Kailon area,